Of the family's men, women were forced to marry them all. The cruelest tradition of consanguinity. In Tennessee's isolated mountains, nestled between deep valleys and dense forests, communities developed customs as disturbing as the very isolation that enveloped them. This is the history of the Caldwell family, whose marriage practices created one of the most genetically compromised lineages ever documented in the southern United States. The year was 1912. While the world watched the Titanic sink and President William Howard Taft led his re-election campaign, a way of life completely oblivious to modernity unfolded in the mountains. Hidden between the valleys, the Caldwells maintained a tradition dating back generations. The family's women were intended to unite with multiple men of the same clan, weaving a web of consanguineous relationships that defied all social and biological norms. Evelina Caldwell was just 16 years old when she became the protagonist of this dark chapter of American history. Born in a rustic cabin in Hancock County, she grew up with no contact with the outside world. Educated only in housework and the peculiar doctrines her grandfather, Silas Caldwell, imposed as absolute law. Silas, the patriarch, was a 67-year-old man whose wrinkled face and severe gaze revealed both years of hard labor and a distorted moral intelligence. With a gray beard that reached his chest and hands calloused from working the earth, he ruled his family with unquestionable authority. His justification for the practice of consanguinity was as simple as it was disturbing. The blood of the Caldwells must remain pure, without mixture. What is born on the mountain belongs to the mountain. The family's property stretched across some 200 acres of mountainous land, with 6 rustic huts spread across the terrain connected by dirt trails. There lived approximately 30 family members, all descendants of Silas and his late wife, Sarah. The isolation was not only geographical but also ideological. The children did not attend school and contact with outsiders was strictly forbidden. Tradition dictated that upon reaching the appropriate age, Caldwell women should first join the older men in the family other than their direct father, usually an uncle or first cousin. Then, progressively, they would become wives to other men of the family in a hierarchy determined by age and position within the clan. The consequences of this practice were etched on the faces of the youngest children. Born from these unions, they often had visible physical deformities, prominent jaws, low foreheads, eyes set too close together, crooked fingers, and significant intellectual deficiencies. When it came to Evelina, the young woman, light brown-haired with melancholy eyes, had only a limited understanding of what her family duty meant. Her mother, Martha, had undergone the same ritual and now, at 35, looked like a woman of 60, consumed by hard labor and multiple pregnancies. Martha had given birth to 8 children, of which only 3 survived, Evelina and her 2 younger brothers, both showing clear signs of cognitive disability. The first husband designated for Evelina was her uncle Ezekiel, her father's brother, a 45-year-old man with a violent temperament and poor hygiene. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took place on a full moon night with all family members gathered around a fire. Silas, as patriarch, led the ritual based on a distortion of biblical scriptures and invented traditions, legitimizing what any outside society would consider an abomination. Evelina did not shed a tear during the ritual. Her face, illuminated by the firelight, showed a resignation that was beyond her years. The same empty look she had observed in her mother's and aunt's eyes. Inside Ezekiel's cabin, where she would now be forced to live, there was only a straw bed, a rustic table, and a few chairs. The walls, made of poorly fitted logs, let the cold wind whistle through the cracks. What no one knew at that moment was that, unlike the other women in the family, Evelina had had a brief contact with the outside world. 2 years earlier, during a rare trip to the nearest town to sell farm goods, she had spoken with a local teacher who, sensing her situation, had secretly given her a book. For months, Evelina had learned to read in hiding, absorbing ideas that showed her a reality existed beyond the mountains. While the other family members celebrated with homemade liquor, Evelina kept a seed of resistance within her. Hidden under the straw mattress in a cloth bag was the book that had changed her perspective. A collection of stories about women who had challenged the conventions of their times. On the horizon, clouds gathered, foreshadowing a storm. The cold wind sweeping down from the mountains carried the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. It was as if nature itself reflected the whirlwind inside Evelina. What no one could predict was that this young woman would trigger events that would eventually expose the Caldwell's practices to the outside world, leading to the disintegration of generations of isolation and consanguinity. Check to see if you are already subscribed to this channel. You need to know these real stories that reveal humanity's darkest secrets. Stories that no one else has the courage to tell, but we all need to know. Evelina's first weeks in Ezekiel's cabin established a pattern she feared would last the rest of her life. Wake before dawn. Prepare breakfast. Work in the garden. Wash clothes in the nearby stream. Cook, clean, and obey the demands of her husband when he returned from long hours of hunting or working at the illegal still hidden in the property's caves. Ezekiel was not a man given to conversation. With nearly 3 decades on Evelina, he treated her as acquired property. Not unlike the tools he used to work the land or the animals he kept in the small pen behind the cabin. His face, perpetually sunburned, and his calloused hands revealed a hard life of labor. But his eyes, too small, a common family feature, held a coldness that made Evelina tremble. During this period, Evelina carefully observed the patterns and routines of the family. The Caldwell women, though subjugated, had established a silent system of communication and mutual support. During gatherings to wash clothes at the stream or tend vegetables in the communal gardens, they exchanged significant looks and hasty whispers, sharing small strategies for survival. Evelina's Aunt Judith, a 42-year-old woman whose bent body and prematurely aged face told a story of a life of deprivation, became her reluctant confidant. On an October afternoon, as they collected apples in the small orchard, Judith explained in a low voice the reality Evelina would have to face. After Ezekiel, it will be Jeremiah's turn, and after Jeremiah, the young Isaac when he turns 18 next spring, Judith explained, her eyes constantly vigilant to ensure they weren't being observed. That's how it works here. Grandfather Silas says it keeps the blood strong, but look at the children. Look at my children. Judith had 4 living children by different family husbands. The eldest, a 15-year-old boy named Eli, could barely speak and had difficulty with the simplest tasks. His asymmetrical face, one eye visibly larger than the other and a misaligned jaw, was a silent testament to the effects of continued consanguinity. Silas doesn't allow us to see anything wrong with it, Judith continued. He says the children's difficulties are trials sent by God, not the result of our family arrangements. It was at that moment Evelina decided to share her secret with Judith. One night, when Ezekiel was at a meeting with the other family men at the still, Evelina showed her aunt the hidden book and revealed she knew how to read. There's a world out there, Evelina whispered to Aunt Judith, the pages of the book illuminated by the weak light of a candle. A world where women aren't forced to marry their own relatives, where children go to school and aren't born like they are born here. The winter of 1912 to 1913 was particularly severe in the mountains. The snow further isolated the Caldwell property, making the already rare trips to town completely impossible. Inside the cabins, illuminated only by fireplaces and tallow candles, the family survived on food preserved during the fall. Smoked meat, pickled vegetables, cornmeal, and apples stored in the cellar. It was during this winter that Evelina discovered she was expecting a child. The news, which under other circumstances might have brought joy, filled her with a deep terror. She had seen children born in the family. Many didn't survive the first months, and those who did often had serious problems. Cradling her still flat belly, Evelina made a decision. She needed to escape before her child was born into that environment. The plan began to take shape during the long winter nights. With Judith's reluctant help, Evelina began storing small amounts of food, hiding them in a hole under the cabin's floor. She also set aside some pieces of clothing and, more importantly, began to study the rudimentary maps drawn in the book she had, trying to understand how she could navigate the mountains to the nearest town. The biggest challenge would be avoiding recapture. The Caldwell family had connections with other isolated mountain communities, and Silas had made it clear over the years that desertion would not be tolerated. Whispered stories among the women spoke of previous escape attempts that had ended in tragedy. The opportunity arose in early spring of 1913, with the melting snow. The men of the family organized a 3-day hunting expedition to replenish the nearly empty pantry after the long winter. All the women were left on the property with strict orders to prepare the gardens for planting. On the morning of the men's departure, Evelina embraced Judith in a silent goodbye. The aunt, with tears in her eyes, pressed a small package into her niece's hands. Some coins saved over years, hidden in a flap of fabric. "Go east," Judith instructed, following the stream's course. "After 2 days of walking, you'll reach Rogersville. Look for the Methodist church. The pastor there is a good man. He will help you." That night, under the protective cloak of darkness and with only the crescent moonlight to guide her, Evelina Caldwell left behind the only life she had known. Carrying a small bundle with food, some clothes, her precious book, and the coins Judith had given her, she slipped into the forest, following the stream's course as instructed. What she did not know was that her escape would trigger a series of events that would eventually lead to the complete exposure of the Caldwell family's practices, resulting in one of the first documented investigations into consanguinity in the isolated communities of Appalachia. Her 3-day journey through the mountains would be only the beginning of a far greater transformation. Not just of her own life, but of the lives of all the women and children left behind. As she walked through the dark forest, her hand instinctively over her belly where a new life grew, Evelina felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Evelina's trek through the mountains was harder than she could have imagined. Accustomed only to the Caldwell's immediate surroundings, she found the world beyond was both vaster and more dangerous than her books had suggested. On the second day of her journey, a heavy rain soaked her and ruined her provisions. Hunger and exhaustion dominating her body, Evelina found shelter under a rocky overhang. It was there, shivering as she tried to light a small fire, that she experienced her first moment of true despair. "What if it's better for the child if I go back?" she whispered to herself, her protective hands on her belly. "What if we die here in the mountains?" The thought of returning to Ezekiel's cabin, of submitting again to the system she had fled, sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. No, she decided firmly. Any fate is better than that one. With renewed determination, Evelina continued her journey as soon as the rain subsided. At dusk on the 3rd day, exhausted and starving, she finally spotted the first houses of Rogersville. The small town, with its dirt streets and modest buildings, looked like a metropolitan center compared to the isolation in which she had lived. With dirty, torn clothes, tangled hair, and bare feet bleeding from cuts suffered during the walk, Evelina attracted looks of distrust and pity as she made her way toward the town center, searching for the Methodist church Judith had mentioned. The church was a simple white-painted wooden building with a modest belfry and a small cemetery beside it. As Evelina approached the door, her legs finally gave way to tiredness, and she fell to her knees on the entrance steps. This was how Reverend Thomas Wilson found her, a pregnant young woman, semi-conscious from exhaustion, murmuring incoherently about escaping the Caldwells. The Reverend, a middle-aged man with grey hair and kind eyes behind round spectacles, needed little explanation. He had heard rumors about the isolated families in the mountains and their peculiar practices, though the full extent of what occurred remained a mystery to most townsfolk. "My wife will look after you," he said kindly, helping Evelina into the parish house adjacent to the church. "You're safe now." Martha Wilson, the Reverend's wife, was a practical woman with nursing experience. She tended to Evelina's injuries, fed her hot soup, and put her in a clean bed, simple luxuries the young woman hadn't experienced for years, if ever. In the days that followed, as she regained her strength, Evelina gradually told her story to the Wilsons. The couple listened with increasing horror to the details of life on the Caldwell property, the forced unions among close relatives, the children born with disabilities, the absolute control exerted by Patriarch Silas. "What you call marriage isn't recognized by law," Reverend Wilson explained carefully. "What was done to you and the other women is considered a crime in this state." The idea that the practices she had known all her life were not only morally questionable but illegal was revelatory for Evelina. For the first time, she truly processed the abnormality of the life she had left behind. If you're feeling your stomach turn with this story, leave justice for Evelina in the comments. It's important that stories like these are known so such atrocities never happen again. Meanwhile, back on the Caldwell property, the men's return from the hunting expedition had triggered a crisis. Evelina's absence was immediately noted, and Ezekiel, humiliated and enraged by his young wife's desertion, demanded retribution. Patriarch Silas organized a search of the property and surroundings, but Evelina's trail had already been washed away by the rain. It was Judith who, risking her own safety, suggested that Evelina had probably died in the forest, taken by hunger or wild animals. The suggestion, though macabre, temporarily satisfied the men's fury, and they soon turned their attention to more pressing matters, like preparing the soil for spring planting. In Rogersville, as the weeks passed, Evelina's presence in the parish house began to generate curiosity in the small community. Reverend Wilson, concerned that the Caldwells might eventually discover her whereabouts, contacted a friend in Knoxville, a doctor named James Harrington who had an interest in studies of consanguinity and its effects. Dr. Harrington arrived in Rogersville on a May afternoon, bringing with him medical equipment and a sharp scientific interest in Evelina's story. As one of the first doctors in Tennessee to formally study the genetic effects of consanguineous unions, he saw in the fugitive young woman an opportunity to document a case that until then had existed mainly in medical theory. "What you describe," he explained to Evelina during his initial examination, "is a system of extreme endogamy, far beyond what is typically seen even in isolated communities. The fact that multiple men of the same lineage, joining with the same women exponentially increases the risks to the offspring." Examining Evelina carefully, Dr. Harrington noticed subtle characteristics that suggested generations of consanguinity, a slightly shorter stature than normal, a specific curvature of the jawline, and the spacing of her eyes. Though Evelina was one of the fortunate ones without serious issues, the signs were there for a trained eye. "Your baby," he said cautiously, "is at significant risk. I can't predict for sure, but modern science suggests that children born of such close unions often develop serious complications." The news, though not entirely unexpected, devastated Evelina. Cradling her now visibly protruding belly, she wondered what kind of life she could offer a child who might face challenges from birth. It was Martha Wilson who comforted her that night, sitting on the edge of her bed as silent tears ran down the young woman's face. "You've already shown more courage than most people show in a lifetime," Martha said, holding Evelina's hand. "No matter what happens, you won't be alone." By June 1913, with her advanced state making it impossible to hide her presence, word of Evelina reached the local sheriff. Concerned about the legal implications and the possibility of retaliation from the Caldwells, Sheriff Thomas Jenkins paid a formal visit to the parish house. "Reverend," he said, removing his hat as he entered, "I've been hearing disturbing rumors about a young woman sheltered here, fleeing an unusual situation in the mountains." What followed was a long conversation in which Evelina, with the support of Reverend Wilson and Dr. Harrington, recounted her experience. The sheriff, a man of rigid but righteous principles, was visibly disturbed by the account. "Miss Caldwell," he said finally, "what you describe are serious crimes under Tennessee law. If you're willing to give a formal testimony, I can open an investigation." The decision Evelina faced was monumental. Officially denouncing the family's practices would mean not only exposing Silas and the other men but also bringing unwanted attention to the women and children she had left behind. On the other hand, remaining silent would mean allowing the cycle to continue indefinitely. That night, alone in her room in the parish house, Evelina opened her worn book, the spark that had ignited her journey to freedom. Among its pages, she found the courage she needed in the stories of women who had changed not only their own lives but the lives of others around them. The next morning, with a firm hand on a Bible in the sheriff's office, Evelina Caldwell gave her formal testimony. What she did not know was that her words would initiate one of the first official investigations into forced consanguinity in the United States, eventually leading to changes in state laws regarding marriage and child protection. As summer advanced and her delivery date approached, Evelina alternated between moments of fierce determination and absolute terror. The future, once so rigidly defined by the limits of the Caldwell property, now lay open before her, vast, uncertain, and, despite all the challenges, finally hers to determine. One muggy morning in July 1913, Evelina's labor began. Martha Wilson, with her experience as the community's informal midwife, prepared the back room of the parish house with hot water, clean towels, and the medicinal herbs she used to ease childbirth. Dr. Harrington, who had extended his stay in Rogersville specifically to attend the birth, arrived shortly after the first signs, bringing his medical bag and an air of professional concern. The labor was long and difficult. For over 20 hours, Evelina fought through increasingly intense contractions, her young and relatively healthy body working to bring into the world a child whose destiny had been marked by generations of choices not her own. "You're doing wonderfully," encouraged Martha, wiping the sweat from Evelina's forehead with a damp cloth. "Breathe deeply, just as I showed you." In the early hours of the next morning, with the first rays of sun filtering through the lace curtains, a baby girl was born, letting out a surprisingly strong cry that filled the room. Dr. Harrington examined her immediately, his experienced eyes searching for the signs he feared. The relief on his face was visible when he finally wrapped the newborn in a clean blanket and handed her to Evelina. "She appears healthy," he said, allowing himself a rare smile. "We'll need to observe her carefully in the coming months. But for now, you have a strong daughter." Evelina looked at the small, red, wrinkled face, feeling a wave of protective love so intense it nearly stole her breath. The baby's eyes, though still unfocused, seemed to look straight at her with an intensity that made her heart clench. "Hope," whispered Evelina, gently touching her daughter's soft cheek. "Your name will be Hope." The choice of name was no accident. Hope represented everything Evelina had risked her life to find and everything she wanted for her daughter's future. While mother and daughter rested, the world beyond the parish house walls continued to move. The investigation begun by Evelina's testimony had grown in scope and urgency. Sheriff Jenkins, initially skeptical of the extent of the allegations, had gathered enough evidence to justify a larger operation involving county officials and even a representative from the state attorney's office. One August morning, when Hope was just 3 weeks old, a delegation of 5 armed men led by the sheriff set out for the mountains where the Caldwell property was located. Their mission was twofold: to investigate the allegations of forced and illegal unions, and to verify the well-being of the women and children still living under Silas's control. What they found surpassed even Evelina's descriptions. The property, seen in the light of an official investigation, revealed a microcosm of misery and degradation. Precariously built and badly deteriorated cabins housed women with empty stares and children with visible deformities. Silas maintained records, a bizarre combination of family tree and lineage control that resembled animal breeding more than human relations, that provided irrefutable evidence of the forced consanguinity system that had persisted for at least 4 generations. Silas Caldwell, confronted by official authorities for the first time in his long life as patriarch, reacted with a mixture of religious outrage and incoherent threats. When the sheriff presented the arrest warrant, the old man tried to resist, only to be quickly subdued. "What we do here is sacred," he shouted as he was led from the property. "The blood must remain pure. You have no right to interfere with God's laws." Ezekiel and the other adult men in the family were also detained, accused of various crimes from illegal relations to child abuse. The women and children, many seeing outsiders for the first time, were temporarily relocated to a makeshift shelter in town as authorities tried to determine the next steps. News of the Caldwell family and their practices soon spread beyond Rogersville. Newspapers in Knoxville and even Nashville published sensational reports about the colony of consanguinity discovered in the Tennessee mountains. The case quickly became a talking point for social reformers, doctors interested in genetics, and legislators concerned with gaps in existing laws. For Evelina, now settled in a small room at the back of the general goods store where she had gotten a job as a helper, the attention was both validating and disturbing. On one hand, the public exposure of the family's practices meant authorities couldn't simply ignore the situation. On the other, the sensational reports often portrayed all the Caldwells, including the women and children, as mountain degenerates, ignoring the complex reality of victims and perpetrators. "They treat us like animals in a show," Evelina commented bitterly to Martha Wilson during one of her weekly visits, while nursing Hope in her arms. The same people who pretended not to see what was happening in the mountains for decades now want to examine our lives as if we were specimens in a laboratory. The trial of Silas Caldwell and the other family men began in October 1913. The county courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Curious spectators from neighboring towns traveled for hours to witness what the newspapers called the mountain trial. Evelina, called as the prosecution's star witness, faced her greatest challenge yet. Dressed in a simple blue dress borrowed from Martha, she walked to the witness stand with her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look toward where Silas, Ezekiel, and the other family men were seated. When she finally raised her eyes, she found Silas's gaze, a look not of remorse or shame, but of pure fury. The silent message was clear: she had betrayed her family, exposed its secrets, challenged his authority. For 4 hours, Evelina answered the prosecutor's questions, then endured a hostile cross-examination from the defense attorney, a man hired by a local church that believed the case represented improper government interference in family affairs. "Miss Caldwell," asked the defense attorney, a thin man with a pencil mustache and calculating eyes, "is it not true that you were never legally married to Ezekiel Caldwell? That there was, in fact, no civil ceremony recognized by the state?" "There was no legal ceremony," Evelina answered firmly. "There was a ritual led by Silas, based on his own interpretations of Scripture. And you participated in this ritual voluntarily, correct?" Evelina felt a warmth spread from her neck to her cheeks. "I was 16. I was raised believing I had no choice. It was my duty." "Duty to whom, exactly?" "To the family. To the blood. As Silas always said." The lawyer smiled coldly. "And yet, when you decided that this duty no longer suited you, you simply fled. You abandoned your family." Before Evelina could answer, the prosecutor rose to object. "Your Honor, the witness is a victim, not an accused." The judge, an elderly man whose face was marked by deep wrinkles of expression, nodded. "Sustained. Counsel will restrict himself to facts relevant to this case." Despite the hostile interrogation, Evelina's testimony, buttressed by the records found on the property and Dr. Harrington's medical reports on the condition of the Caldwell children, was devastating to the defense. In late November, after 3 weeks of testimony, the jury returned with the verdict, guilty. Silas Caldwell was sentenced to 15 years in prison for multiple violations of state marriage laws and coercion. Ezekiel and the other men received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. The Caldwell women and children faced a different fate. With the property confiscated by the state and no means of subsistence, they were temporarily placed in various charitable institutions. The younger children, especially those with severe impairments, were sent to state institutions, a destination that, though different from the isolation of the mountains, rarely offered much better conditions in early 20th century America. Judith, who had risked everything to help Evelina escape, eventually managed to settle on a small farm on the outskirts of Rogersville, where she worked as a washerwoman for local families. Her children, including Eli with his special needs, remained with her, a rare victory in a story marked by so many losses. For Evelina, the end of the trial brought temporary relief, but not the closure she had expected. Nights were still often interrupted by nightmares where she was back in Ezekiel's cabin, unable to escape. During the day, when she visited the market, she occasionally caught stares and whispers that followed her, a mixture of morbid curiosity and silent judgment. "You'll always be that Caldwell girl," Martha Wilson had said kindly, but also with realism. "Not to us, but to many in this town. Perhaps it's time to consider a new beginning, somewhere where your name and your story don't precede you." The suggestion planted a seed in Evelina's mind. As hope grew, becoming a pink-cheeked girl with brown curls and a smile surprisingly free of any shadow from the past, Evelina began to consider possibilities beyond Rogersville. It was Dr. Harrington who finally offered the opportunity she needed. Having returned to Knoxville after the trial, he continued his studies on the effects of consanguinity, now with a special interest in Hope's development. During one of his regular visits, he brought a proposal. The University of Tennessee is establishing a special program to study the genetic effects of various conditions, he explained. They need an administrative assistant, someone to organize files, transcribe notes, that sort of thing. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays reasonably well and comes with campus accommodations. Evelina, now 18 years old with her nearly 1-year-old daughter, saw in the offer more than just a job. It was a chance to rebuild her life in an environment where her story, though not entirely forgotten, wouldn't be the sole defining factor of her identity. In January 1914, with Hope in her arms and a small suitcase containing all her belongings, Evelina boarded the train to Knoxville. Looking out the window as the mountain landscape slid away, she felt a complex mix of emotions. There was sadness for the women and children who couldn't escape, determination to build something better for her daughter, and a growing sense of purpose. What had begun as a simple escape was now turning into something larger. The Caldwell case, though far from unique, had exposed a dark reality many would rather ignore: the human consequences of generations of isolation and consanguinity in Appalachia's remote communities. The work Evelina would do at the university, though modest in scope, would contribute to an understanding that would eventually help prevent stories like hers. As the train gained speed, moving away from the shadows of the mountains toward the city's lights, Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms. Her future, unlike so many Caldwell children before her, was not predetermined by an inescapable cycle of isolation and consanguinity. Whatever life held for her, Hope would have what her mother had risked everything to get: a choice. Knoxville, 1923. A decade had passed since Evelina Caldwell had left the mountains with her newborn daughter. The city, while still modest by the standards of great American metropolises, seemed a world apart from the isolated slopes of the Appalachians. The University of Tennessee campus, with its red brick buildings and majestic oaks, had become home to Evelina and Hope. What had begun as a temporary position as an administrative assistant had evolved over the years. Evelina, demonstrating a keen intelligence and thirst for knowledge that decades of isolation had failed to suffocate, had eventually gained a position as a research assistant in the Department of Social Studies under Dr. Harrington. Hope, now 10, was a remarkably healthy and bright child, without any of the physical or cognitive signs that had marked so many Caldwell children. With wavy brown hair framing a lively, expressive face, she had inherited her mother's perceptive eyes but carried none of the shadow that often darkened Evelina's gaze. That particular afternoon, mother and daughter walked across the campus, enjoying the warmth of the early fall. Hope, dressed in a simple blue dress and polished shoes, held her mother's hand as she talked. "Mom," Hope asked, her clear voice cutting through the afternoon, "why does Dr. Harrington always examine me so carefully during our visits? I'm not sick." Evelina looked at her daughter, carefully considering her answer. Over the years, she had wrestled with the question of how much and when to tell Hope about her origins. The girl knew only fragments, that her mother had come from the mountains, that her father wasn't part of their lives, that they were somehow special for Dr. Harrington's studies. Dr. Harrington is a scientist who studies how families pass traits from parents to children, Evelina explained, choosing her words carefully. You help him understand important things that can help other children. Hope considered this for a moment, her young face serious with contemplation. Is it because of my father? Because he was related to you? Evelina stopped walking, feeling as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. In all the scenarios she had imagined for this conversation, she had never considered that Hope might have already deduced parts of the truth on her own. Where did you hear that?" she asked, her voice shakier than she would have liked. Hope shrugged with the typical direct frankness of childhood. "I heard Dr. Harrington talking to Professor Wheeler about the Caldwell case and how I was a remarkable example of genetic resilience despite parental consanguinity. I looked the word up in the dictionary." Evelina felt a mixture of pride in her daughter's intelligence and despair at not being able to protect her from this truth any longer. Guiding Hope to a bench under an oak tree, she sat and pulled her daughter close. "There are parts of our story I was hoping to share with you when you were older," Evelina began, "but you've always been more insightful than I expected." Over the next hour, sitting under the oak while the autumn sun filtered through the golden leaves, Evelina told a simplified but honest version of her history. She spoke of the Caldwell family in the mountains, how they lived isolated from the world, about traditions that forced relatives to marry each other, and her escape to give Hope a different life. Hope listened with an intensity that seemed beyond her years, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions. When Evelina finished, the girl remained silent for several long moments. "So that's why we don't have other relatives," she said finally. "And that's why you never wanted to go back to the mountains?" "Yes," Evelina answered gently. "But I want you to understand something very important. What happened doesn't define who you are. You're your own person, Hope. Always will be." Hope nodded slowly, processing everything she had heard. Then, in a movement that brought tears to Evelina's eyes, the girl leaned in and hugged her mother firmly. "You were very brave, Mom," she whispered. "Just like in the stories you read to me at bedtime." That conversation marked a turning point in the relationship between mother and daughter. With the secrets of the past now partially revealed, a new honesty flourished between them. Hope, with her natural curiosity now fueled by fragments of her family history, began to ask more questions, not just about the Caldwells, but about consanguinity, genetics, and the studies in which she and her mother had become an integral part. In 1925, when Hope was 12, Evelina's work with Dr. Harrington culminated in a significant academic publication, Generational Effects of Continuous Consanguinity, a case study of Appalachia. The study, which maintained the anonymity of its subjects but detailed the genetic and social patterns observed in the Caldwell family and similar families, became an important reference in the emerging field of behavioral genetics. For Evelina, the publication represented a complete transformation from a silent victim to an active contributor to scientific knowledge that could eventually help prevent situations like the one she had faced. It was also during this period that Evelina received an unexpected letter from Rogersville. Martha Wilson, who had remained a faithful correspondent over the years, wrote with news that reopened old wounds. Silas Caldwell had died in the state prison at the age of 80. "I thought you would want to know," Martha wrote, "that before his death, he asked to speak with a chaplain." No one knows what was said in that final conversation, but the chaplain later commented that even the hardest heart may eventually face its own truth. The news stirred in Evelina a storm of conflicting emotions. There was no forgiveness in her heart for the man who had perpetuated generations of suffering, but there was a strange sense of closure. The letter also contained news of the other Caldwell women. Judith, who had remained in Rogersville, had established a small informal community for some of her family's former women who had managed to rebuild their lives after the trial. Together, they operated a small laundry that had become a modest but stable business. "They speak of you often," Martha wrote. "For many of the younger women, you've become a kind of legend. The girl who escaped and changed everything. Some are even sending their daughters to school, inspired by what they've heard about you and hope." The idea that her escape had somehow paved the way for other women was simultaneously humbling and empowering for Evelina. The cycle that had seemed unbreakable had been, if not completely broken, at least significantly weakened. In 1928, when Hope turned 15, the same age Evelina had been when she began planning her escape, mother and daughter made an important decision. It was time to revisit the past, literally. The journey back to Rogersville and eventually to the old Caldwell lands was not easy. Each kilometer traveled by train seemed to pull Evelina deeper into memories she had worked hard to subdue. But beside her was Hope, strong, confident, curious, a living reminder that not all stories are condemned to repeat their darkest chapters. Martha Wilson, now a white-haired widow but with the same kind eyes, greeted them at the station. The reunion was emotional, with long embraces and tears that spoke more than words could express. "You've become a remarkable woman," Martha said, holding Evelina's face between her wrinkled hands. "And this must be Hope. My God, she has your eyes." The visit with Judith and the other Caldwell women was equally moving. In a small converted house on the edge of town, Evelina rediscovered women who had shared her childhood and youth, faces that bore the marks of time but also a new dignity that had been absent in the property days. "You paved the way," said Judith, now a middle-aged woman with graying hair and hands calloused from work. "After you fled, something changed. It was as if you'd shown them it was possible." The hardest part of the trip was the visit to the land that had once belonged to the Caldwells. Abandoned after the trial, the property was now partially reclaimed by vegetation that covered the spaces where the cabins had stood. Evelina walked slowly through what had been the center of the property, Hope respectfully a few steps behind, stopping where Silas's main cabin had been. Evelina felt a tremor go through her body, not of fear or anger, but of a strange sense of liberation. "This place has no power over me anymore," she said finally, turning to look at her daughter. "It will never have power over you." Hope, who had been quiet for most of the exploration, approached and took her mother's hand. "What happened here? It's part of our history, but it's not our future." On the trip back to Knoxville, sitting side by side on the train as the mountain landscape gradually gave way to plains, Evelina reflected on the extraordinary journey she had traveled, not just the physical distance from the mountains to the university, but the transformation from a frightened young woman without formal education into a woman who now contributed to scientific knowledge and social change. Most importantly, she looked at Hope, healthy, intelligent, with a bright future ahead of her, and saw the true measure of her victory against the Caldwell cycle of consanguinity. In 1930, Hope Caldwell became the first of her lineage to enter university, deciding to study medicine with a focus on genetics, a choice directly influenced by her own history. Evelina, now a respected researcher and occasional speaker on the social and medical effects of community isolation, watched with inexpressible pride as her daughter charted a path that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. Evelina's work, combined with studies by other researchers inspired by her case, eventually influenced changes in state laws regarding consanguineous marriage and how authorities dealt with isolated communities. Instead of sensationalism or neglect, a new approach began to emerge, one that recognized the complexity of these situations and sought interventions that protected the vulnerable while respecting the dignity of all involved. On a fall afternoon in 1932, 20 years after her escape from the mountains, Evelina Caldwell was sitting in her university office reviewing notes for a lecture when she received an unexpected visit. A young woman, visibly nervous and carrying a small child, knocked shyly on her door. "Mrs. Caldwell," the visitor asked hesitantly. "My name is Sarah. Sarah Jenkins. I came from a community in the Kentucky mountains. They told me you could help me." Looking at the young mother's anxious face, Evelina saw a reflection of herself 2 decades earlier, frightened but determined to break a cycle that had trapped generations. With a kind smile, she invited Sarah to come in and sit down. "You've already taken the first and hardest step," Evelina said, her voice calm and firm. "And yes, I can help you. We can help each other." As the autumn sun cast a golden light through the office window, illuminating the hopeful face of the young mother and her child, Evelina felt a deep sense of purpose. The story of the Caldwells, her story, had not ended in the isolated mountains of Tennessee. It continued through every woman who found the courage to break cycles of abuse and isolation, through every child born with the opportunity to define their own destiny. The cruelest tradition of consanguinity had been broken, not just for one family, but potentially for many. And in that, Evelina Caldwell found her true liberation. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel. It is extremely important that stories like these are known so we can protect future generations from practices that cause so much human suffering. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who truly appreciates the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to leave your like and share with someone who needs to know about this dark reality that existed in our society. Together, we can ensure such practices remain only on the pages of history.